Hello, good morning, very warm welcome to this first session. Доброе утро, рада всех увидеть здесь на первую сессию. У нас очень интересная сессия начинается сегодня со Стефанией, которая будет нам представлять из Университета Италии Film Music as Propaganda, Conveying State Ideologies for Music in the Battle for our Soviet Ukraine. I'm delighted to welcome Stefania Feletto from the University of Padua in Italy. And her paper is going to be titled Film Music as Propaganda, Conveying State Ideology Through Music in the Battle for Our Soviet Ukraine. So I warmly welcome her to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll share a presentation. Okay. So you see the presentation, right? Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me and thanks for being here. The Battle for Our Soviet Ukraine is a documentary film released in 1943 by Soviet Ukrainian director Alexander Dovzhenko and directed by Yulia Sontseva and Yakov Avdyenko. It's a war propaganda film produced in the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. And this paper will look at the interaction between visual sphere and the soundscape in the cinematic medium, including voice, sound, diegetic, and extra-diegetic music. My purpose is to investigate through which artistic tools propaganda contents are conveyed and how music provides the viewer with an ideological interpretation of reality. Although the study of war films may seem less significant than other conflicts-related aspects, propaganda cinema proves an important research area to be explored, especially in the present, while we are facing a new wave of political propaganda globally. Investigating the mechanism by which propaganda has been implemented in the past is vital to deepening our understanding of its effects on the viewer. So even before the beginning of the World War II, every belligerent nation saw propaganda as a crucial tool for gaining popular support. Totalitarian regimes exploited cinema in addition to the press and radio to spread their political messages. They recognize a great potential inherent to the new media in order to win a favor and strengthen the war effort. Cinema became a propagandistic tool at the service of the state in all totalitarian regimes. Let's think about the Istituto Luce, an Italian film journalistic corporation created in 1824 by the fascist regime and put under Mussolini's direct control, who personally oversaw the production and distribution of cinema materials. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels, as the Third Reich's propaganda minister, intended cinema as a strategic tool for educating German people according to the idea of Aryan race, cultural, and artistic superiority. Likewise, the Soviet leadership hoped to instill similar feelings into its own people and consequently regarded cinema as the best tool to achieve this. In 1822, Lenin stated that of all the arts, for us, the cinema is the most important. Cinema was given a leading role, and this also happened thanks to the simultaneous development of Russian cinematography and the cultural and social revolution in the 20s. Lenin had already understood that cinema must not be poor entertainment. Propaganda contents had to reach less educated population and therefore could easily drive the thoughts of a large mass of individuals. In Russia, cinema was nationalized by Lenin in 1919, and in the first half of the 20s, it developed into a golden age, thanks to the vitality of the other avant-gardes. Soviet montage theorists became an international reference point, and director Sergei Eisenstein was among the main exponents and innovators, together with Vsevolod Pudovkin, Grigory Alexandrov, Giga Vertov, and Alexander Dovzhenko. It's among these directors that the first reflections on the use of sound in cinema in the Soviet Union emerged. The debate began even before this technical innovation arrived in film studios. The first Soviet sound projection dates back only to March 1930. And in 1931, there was the only one theater in Moscow in the entire Soviet Union, which was equipped to broadcast sound films. The directors reflected on the potential of sound from different points of view. Esfir Shub, Soviet director and editor, was fascinated by the chance to go out far from the studio and record live sounds. Her interest was to find out how this can influence the visual values and potential of the film. Eisenstein, Pudovkin, and Alexandrov wrote the statement on sound, also known as Manifesto of Asynchronism, in 1828, in which they illustrated a new theory of the use of sound in cinema. The three directors highlighted the risk that cinema faced, namely an inadequate exploitation of sound when this serves to the ordinary synchronization with images. They were concerned that sound is being used following the law of minimum effort, that is, with the function of illustration of the images. What they wanted instead is the use of sound in counterpoint with the images, aiming at a dissociation from the visual. This use would have led to the creation of a new orchestral counterpoint between visual and sonic representation. What had to be avoided was synchrony according to the principle of realism. Giga Vertov, author of the first film sound documentary, Enthusiasm, discussed the issue of sound cinema, pointing on the authentic nature of sound. He distinguished between natural noises and imitative sound recorded on studio equipment. But despite the controversy surrounding the statement on sound, he based his movies on the same principle of counterpoint and asynchrony that Eisenstein theorized. Regardless of different paradigms, sound cinema, especially the documentary genre, stands out as a powerful means of propaganda. Soviet director Nikolai Anoshenko stressed that cinema must be used with the same speed and power as the capitalist world. He remarked the importance of not wasting this potential for entertainment alone. Sound cinema was regarded as a political weapon. That is why we think that the main type of sound film here in the USSR should be the political education film and the sound newsreel. There is no doubt that given the profession of the task confronting us, need at least a weekly newsreel. In the 30s, the central government imposed the canon of socialist realism on filmmakers. The official press criticized the directors, accusing them of being formalists and producing incomprehensible and confused films designed for refined foreign connoisseurs and not for illiterate peasants. Filmmakers who did not align with the party's demands, including Lev Kuleshov and Giga Vertov, did not receive funding for their projects or were censored. Andrei Zhdanov, secretary of the Central Committee and responsible for ideology, enacted harsh repressions against artists who did not follow this aesthetic model. The new demand was to represent reality in its revolutionary development, and for this reason, the artists had to address the public by proposing patriotic examples. In 1941, Zhdanov stated about Soviet foreign policy that he aimed at expanding socialism. In his view, this would have been possible if the people were educated according to a spirit of hatred against the enemies of socialism and according to a spirit of will of sacrifice. First, people had to be ready to destroy every country and every bourgeois coalition, and the filmmakers had the task of educating the public in the spirit of attack. Secondly, the films also had the objective of exporting socialist ideas to the world. So on June 22nd, 1941, German army invaded the Soviet Union and began the Operation Barbarossa, hence the Great Patriotic War. Cinematography was completely invested with the role of carrier of the propaganda message. Films, especially documentaries, had to encourage all Soviet citizens, regardless of race, age, or sex, to do their part. Film production moved to the east, to Central Asia in Alma-Ata and to Siberia. After a period of adaptation, the production of newsreels, correspondence from the front, documentaries, and feature films increased. Given the war in which the Soviet Union was involved and the demands made by the party, the directors of the Golden Age had to reinvent themselves and adapt to the new guidelines. Among these directors was Dovzhenko, who nowadays is recognized as one of the best screenwriters and filmmakers in the world. During the first days of the war, he switched to the documentary genre. Through his art, he reflected personal suffering and showed on the screen the history of Soviet Union, and in particular, the reality of life in Ukraine. When the Great Patriotic War broke out, Dovzhenko described it in his diaries what was happening in Ukraine. He spoke of more than 500,000 people killed and an incalculable number of people who died of famine. Dovzhenko was critical of the Soviet government. He couldn't accept to see his dream of national independence crushed. He claimed his Ukrainian identity, but masked these thoughts in his works and abandoned his political views, fearing retaliation. He ultimately fitted the imposed guidelines. In 1843, Dovzhenko directed the propaganda documentary, the film The Battle for Our Soviet Ukraine, produced for the Russian Central Studio of Documentary Films in Moscow. Beginning in May, the film was completed on the 6th of October and screened in film venues on the 25th of October of the same year. The documentary's original title had to be Ukraine. The adjective Soviet served to dampen the nationalistic interpretation. It should be emphasized that the issue concerned the Soviet Union as a whole. In 1844, Dovzhenko also made a second film on the same theme, Victory on the Right Bank, Ukraine. Instead, the screenplay of the third film, which would have been born from the writing Ukrainian Flames, was blocked. In the Battle for Our Soviet Ukraine, the director highlights the heroism with which the Red Army fights and wins the battle against the Nazis in the territories of Kharkiv, Kiev, Lviv, Mariupol. The film alternates battlefields and bucolic images, peasant women and men before 1941, and afterwards reduced to living in the rubble of their villages. Dovzhenko underlines, above all, the suffering and loss of life recorded in Ukraine. Dovzhenko himself wrote the reflections accompanying the film, which have been read and interpreted by the actor Leonid Khmara. The film was well received by the political establishment, and Dovzhenko was awarded with a military decoration. He was at the front shooting these images, which were complemented by those of other film operators and hijacked footage owned by the German army. Newsreel production usually followed pre-established patterns. The images shot at the front were assembled on a voiceover and a soundtrack chosen by a director in Moscow. Shooters had no say in the soundtrack, just as those who assembled the images had no say in the shooting process. Lacking communication between these two phases, it followed that many of the works of this period were not, so to speak, masterpieces. Quite the opposite, Dovzhenko's documentary is unique in this context because the director transmitted his own personal vision through the images he shot, and by giving clear indication to the operators on what had to be filmed. Dovzhenko asked them to shoot the foreground faces of peasants, girls, children, young people, workers, but above all, children. He wanted faces to be highly expressive and to perceive the fatigue of work and the suffering that people experienced. The director took care of both editing of the shots and the soundtrack of the film. The soundtrack of this documentary consists of voices, extradiegetic and diegetic, sounds, noises, and extradiegetic orchestral music. According to Jeremy Hicks, who analyzed the function of the voice in this essay, challenging the voice of God in documentaries, there are two types of voices in this film: the extradiegetic voice of the narrator as a voiceover, and the intradiegetic ones of the witnesses who are interviewed. Hicks highlights how the interdiegetic voices of the witnesses serve to give a voice to the survivors of the German occupation in Ukraine. The narrating voice is used in an alternation of increasing and decreasing, thereby following the dramatic intensity and drama of the images. The use of the diegetic voices instead differs from the typical tone of voiceover in documentaries, which generally reproduce a monolithic style, so to say, of the voice of God or political leader. On the contrary, Dovzhenko wanted to convey the emotion firsthand by means of diegetic voices. In doing so, his interviews anticipate the way in which the post-war media, documentary films, and above all television, will use voices of witnesses in synchronous sound sequences at important historical events. Diegetic voices are used to tell, Diegetic voices are used to tell the story of the civilian victims of the Nazis from a subjective point of view. It is also an attempt to locate the narrative in a specific time and place in contrast to certain super historical mythical tones, which are quite common in Soviet narrative of the war. The music for the film was written by two Soviet Ukrainian composers, Dmitry Klebanov and Andrei Shtokarenko. Dmitry Klebanov approached music through the study of the violin. He trained in Kharkiv, studying composition, and subsequently took up orchestral conducting. He is recognized as one of the founders of the so-called Kharkiv School of Composition. His language, although influenced by Shostakovich, does not abandon tonal writing. Andrei Stokarenko trained at the Russian Music Society in Yekaterinoslav, taught singing in school, and organized his own orchestra. He studied composition at the Conservatory of Kharkiv and occupied important administrative positions within the Musical Academy. Shtokarenko is considered a remarkably talented composer who brings together an amalgam of the Ukrainian, Russian, and popularly inspired national school. So, what function has music in Dovzhenko's film? As said above, the film mainly alternates war scene, battlefields, and misery with scenes of peasants who live happy moments of lightheartedness, work in the fields, or celebrate the progress and victories of their country. For almost its entire duration, the orchestral extra-diegetic music comment on what is shown on the screen. Music and voices serve to polarize images by categorizing them as good or evil, positive or negative, friend or estranged, and amplifying their intensity. A melodious cantable music connotes positively the images of landscapes of the peasant world. Sometimes the orchestral music is replaced by an extra-diegetic song in post-synchronization, always of a peasant character, and reflects the bucolic tone of the images. Brilliant and triumphant music celebrates moment of victory of the Soviet army over the Nazis, or enhance the size of the factories, the work in the homeland. At the opposite, loud, deafening, percussive, and dramatic music connotes negatively scenes of suffering of the Ukrainian people, as well as scenes of war and images of the German army. The music is totally absent in the sequences of major intensity, that is, when the relatives of dead people or survivors are speaking or crying. The viewer hears only the stories in Ukrainian of the witnesses. The expressive potential of these sequences is amplified by the absence of extra-diegetic sounds, which the film otherwise makes constant use of, causing a dramatic emptiness effect. The music commentary follows the meanings of the scenic events, loading the images with drama and higher intensity. In light of his use of the music in this documentary, Dovzhenko seems to know and adhere to Eisenstein's theories of montage, and as well as in the assumptions of the statement on sound. In some of the most significant sequences, the director creates a dramaturgical counterpoint that shakes the viewer, dissociating the sound commentary from the images, in that the music takes on a tone that contrasts with the images in the visual sphere. I'll show you now a couple of sequences which illustrated what I've just said.
Оплакивает жертвы немецких зверств. Сколько таких городов, сколько страшных ям на обездоленной украинской земле. Вот освобожденный Донбасс. Обнажите головы, современники великих битв. Это наши дети и жены, отцы и матери. Их убили фашисты. Вот они, гитлеровские мерзавцы. Вот он, позор человечества. Смотрите, ненавидьте, презирайте проклятых убийц наших детей, растлителей наших сестер. Не забывайте и не прощайте ни одной материнской слезы. В огне Украина, в огне.
So, as you saw, the sequence is built on a twofold montage process, both visual and sonic. In the visual sphere, one sees the alternation of images of peasants in tears, the corpses of the children, and smiling soldiers. According to Eisenstein's notion of montage of attractions, the succession of these images establishes a cause and effect link in the spectators, who is persuaded that happy German soldiers are the cause of suffering of Ukrainian civilians, and that is the reason why they must be hated. The montage of attraction is reinforced by music commentary. The dramatic music that is heard at this point proves as unempathetic when associated with the images of German soldiers marching and smiling. The vertical montage in a typical dramaturgical counterpoint of happy German soldier and dramatic music scratches. The viewer feels hatred and disgust towards the German soldiers, not only because it is urged by the text pronounced by the extra-diegetic voice that invites them to do so, but because the contrasted character of the image and sound and music triggers a reaction of contempt. Again, the same theme is heard accompanying the images of a victory parade. The counterpoint between dramatic music and images of joy reinforces the individual feelings of patriotism in the Soviet spectator.
Не для вражды, не для убийств и разорений растил вас Сталин, дорогие юноши и девушки. Он готовил из вас строителей великой социалистической державы, участников прекрасной эпохи великих работ. Вы росли мужественными и добрыми от своей доброй и мягкой украинской природы. Вы были в творческой работе, и все ваши необъятные поля уже начали петь песню вашему вдохновению. Но ненадолго улыбнулась вам история. Где вы сейчас? Сколько вас в немецкой неволе оплакивает судьбу свою, сколько погибло?
The final example reverts to the semantic values. While German soldiers are missing corpse of their kameraden, we hear a cheerful, almost funny march, again in counterpoint.
Вот они, ползают, сеятели смерти. Могильщики Европы, фашистские жалкие псы, копошащиеся на блевотинах своих. Хайль, Хайль, Гитлер, Хайль, позор Германии.
In the examples above, it is evident how music, as a powerful instrument of affective and semantic manipulation, loads images with a series of propaganda values. This cluster of meanings, first hatred and disgust, then derision and mockery, is stimulated in the spectator on a non-conscious level by means of strong contrast between the tone of the images. A procedure of dramaturgical counterpoint formulated by Eisenstein in the statement on sound and theorized in those years in the West by other scholars and directors such as Adorno, Eisler, Krakauer, and so on. The propaganda message in Dovzhenko's documentary is made explicit through a text that clearly invites us to hate Nazis and through images showing widespread ruin in Ukraine, but is conveyed at a deeper level through the dialectical tension between the visual and sound components that are perceived in contrast at a preconscious level. So in conclusion, in Dovzhenko's film, like in other propaganda films of that time, the ideological persuasion through audiovisual products proves more effective and subtle than when it is verbally expressed because of music's power to polarize and radicalize a mass of individuals to the point of shaping in depth their emotional and cognitive experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое. I'm going to open up for questions. Does anybody have any immediate question? I have a question, but I'm wondering whether anybody else has a question. We have two hands up. Bella, can we start with you? I think your hand went up first. Sorry, you're on mute still. Can I unmute you?
Yeah. I just wanted to congratulate Stefania for her courage to speak on this subject in our so stressful and depressive situation. And Stefania, auguri complimenti. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, yes, you're right. Also, I know it's really hard. It has been hard to watch such a movie during these times. Also because, of course, it's not possible not to think about the present situation and to connect those images to the images we all have seen these days. So, thank you. Yes.
I think John had a hand up before, but I can now. Yes.
Yep. Thank you very much. Yeah. So my question refers to something that you had mentioned about socialist realism. I thought it was really interesting how you mentioned that one of the main parameters or main pillars of socialist realism was a lot of the works that were created were just not very good. They weren't really made to be of quality. They were mostly made to be a tool, right? As you mentioned, like a propaganda tool, and it was made to serve a certain function and then, be cast aside. And then you also had mentioned that these films were made in a pre-established pattern. And I thought that was really interesting considering the anti-formalist campaigns that were going on at the time. So I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about that it seems as though formalism was being kind of cast aside and yet it was still being utilized and in a way that these films were being created in a certain regimented structure and weren't made to be good. They were just made to be a tool. I was wondering if you could just kind of comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So formalism was criticized because, of course, the party considered some films as those of Eisenstein, for example, formalists, because they were too complicated. There were too many meanings which were not clear enough to the mass of people. So those films were criticized because of their complexity. But the kind of formality which is behind those movies of the war period, I'd say it's a different kind of formality, because during this period during the war, those films were, how to say, more explicit, just easier to understand to the mass. The propaganda which is made, it's really easy to be understood. So those films of the period of the war, they are really less complicated than those created by Eisenstein, Pudovkin. Those directors really thought about a movie which had to be, how to say, more complicated with many different meanings. And also they wanted those films to be appreciated not only in Russia, in the Soviet Union, but also, of course, abroad, in America, in Europe. So those films were criticized because they were not thought to be of propaganda, and they were too complicated, while those of the period of the war, they were definitely less complicated. And yes, it's true that the first movies that were directed after 1941 were not considered like as masterpieces, but it doesn't mean that they are not interesting to look at today, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think there was another hand up. Inna, please.
Yes, I'm going to join Bella and congratulating you on taking this topic. Today, very hot, very complicated topic, but there is for me also like the question. The question is that you view these films as a propaganda, but we're dealing with in our today events and perceptions, of course, coloring the way we look past. But we also have a challenge to disconnect this and place this in the context of the day. And the context is the war. So the word that I didn't hear, but maybe I missed it, it's another P word, patriotism. Because it was instilling patriotism. Because during this time, the mentality, and I think it will enrich your paper if you would talk about the perception of Ukraine, Russia as inseparable at that time of building the new life. Stalin and politician is one thing, but there is also artists like Dovzhenko and so on. Especially Ukraine was the entry point for a Soviet cinema. So they were the crux of this in the earlier century. So I think it would be much richer from my point, and I'm not specialist in this area, if you will add the word patriotism and look at try to give more complexity to the paper.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about?
Yes, actually, you are right, and thank you. It's definitely something I look at more. But yes, it's true. One of the aim of the movie, of the film, was to encourage people and to feel this feeling of union between Ukraine and Russia, but so to feel like all together in the Soviet Union as a whole. It's true that it's a complex movie, I'd say, because Dovzhenko, of course, he wanted to show to the party that he was with the party, that he was communist, and that he supported the war, of course. And so we can say it's propaganda and patriotic war, patriotic film. But in the same time, I'd say that Dovzhenko wanted also to show and underline the situation of Ukraine. So it's true that there is the propaganda, patriotism. He wanted to underline these values. But in the same time, actually, he wanted to show everyone how it was going on, how the situation was there in Ukraine at the time. So yes, it's true, there is patriotism, and definitely I think about it, I'll study about it more. But it's also true that maybe he wanted to, he didn't want patriotism to be on the center in this movie, but for sure there is.
Ukraine was also unaware of Germans entering the Soviet Union. So I think it's a very interesting topic, and I congratulate you on finding it and expanding this in a very complex and interesting paper work.
Very much. Thank you.
Bella, please.
I have another question. The first out of the 3 soundtracks that you played for us by Klebanov, does the music have any national identity? Because the one you have played, I didn't feel this, but is there any Ukrainian, folk elements encrusted within the score?
Well, I can say, I don't know, because I've tried to find more about those 2 composers on the internet, but it has been not that easy. I mean,
Klebanov is very, very...
It's very famous.
Not famous, but well known, yeah.
Yes, it's well known. I mean, there is a lot of his music, but there's not that much written about the soundtracks he wrote for this film or other films. There are many compositions he wrote for orchestra and piano, but I can't recognize those national elements you mentioned.
Because this was the general cultural politics when composers were kind of creating national compositional schools based on local folklore. So I just wanted to understand.
Yes, it will be interesting to find the music, but online I couldn't find it. Also, I was interested in reading it, like to find it, but I couldn't. I didn't find it. So probably there is somewhere in some library somewhere, but sure.
Thank you.
John, yes, please.
Sorry, just as you were speaking about the music, I was wondering if you could just kind of maybe, I don't know if you found something, but I found it was really interesting when you mentioned the contrapuntal idea of the music and the visuals kind of in an interlocking relationship. And I was wondering if, because I'm not really well versed in cinematic music, if this music was ever performed external to the visuals, or if the music was married to the visuals in a way where it would lose some sort of impact if it was only performed as a concert suite. Because I was just trying to look away and seeing if I felt the same things if I wasn't looking at the visuals. I was just wondering if you came across anything.
Well, no, I don't know, but I don't think that music was played anywhere else without the images. I think the music, I'm pretty sure the music was composed for the film. And so probably the composer worked or just he wrote by himself the music, knowing the images he had to accompany. But I think that they were written, music was written by the composer just for the film. And actually, it's interesting what you say, because I wrote in a book where they talk about audiovisuals, and an experiment, an exercise is to understand the function of music and the images, is to listen to the music without the images and to watch the images without the music, in order to feel what you, to understand what you feel just with one of those 2 elements. And it is interesting that if you look at the images, you can think about it, about something. And if you think, if you just listen to the music, probably you wouldn't connected with those images. But when you connected two things together, they create a new message. They create a new, something new that is part of Eisenstein's theories, of course.
Thank you. I just have one question, which is, again, congratulations on your topic. I'm wondering, I mean, we've been talking about socialist realism for a long time and trying to see if actually it's an even useful label to have, and how useful that can be. And I'm wondering whether propaganda as well in this kind of topic becomes a useful label to use. I'm asking for two purposes. Firstly, had this not been sponsored by the Soviet Union, how different would this film have actually been? And I'm wondering whether, again, that's a very difficult question for us to be able to answer properly, but whether it's worth thinking about. And secondly, I mean, why do we term it as propaganda? Is it because it was exported? I know British Pathé showed all of these films in Britain. So there was an element of these kinds of movies were exported so that there could be a rally between the Allies, so that everybody would pull their weight together. So it wasn't necessarily only for Ukraine or for the Soviet Union as a whole. This really did have an international dimension as well. And again, in that respect, does the word propaganda change its nuance in the definition? So for me, my main question for you to think about is whether actually you're on a really exciting topic in terms of actually really starting to dig deeper into this idea of what propaganda is defined by our society today and how that definition might change from various perspectives. Мне переводить вопрос или нормально? Нет? Okay, I just asked if I should translate into Russian. But that's something for you, I think, to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, as you said, it's kind of complicated to define what is propaganda nowadays, because we can find propaganda everywhere. If we use...
but not even nowadays. I mean, even before, like what exactly, had it not been state sponsored, right? How would that human reaction have changed the artistic work? And we've been doing that with socialist realism for decades now. And I think it's time we start doing it with other terms as well. That's just my point. I'm just aware of time. Maybe we leave further questions either for the chat or some kind of space, because I think it's a fascinating topic and it's really bringing out some wonderful ideas from people. But congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.